The American colonies declared their independence in 1776 with the famous line that all men are created equal. But the reality of the revolution told a different story. Women remained subordinate to men, limited by laws, social customs, and finance rules that restricted their rights and autonomy. But that is only part of the story. Women in revolutionary America seized their status as dependents and exploited it for their own benefit. They demanded protections and support that came with the assumption that they were powerless dependents. In doing so, they began to see themselves as individuals with rights, and they helped lay the groundwork for future generations of American feminists. Hello, I'm Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, and welcome to Revolutions in Retrospect, where we explore the histories of the revolutions that remade the Atlantic world. Our guest today on Revolutions Reconsidered is Dr. Jacqueline Beatty, Associate Professor of History at York College of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Beatty.
Thanks for having me.
We are very happy to have you here to talk about your book, Independence: Women and the Patriarchal Stake in Revolutionary America, which looks at women's lives in the era of the American Revolution. So I want to start off by setting the chronology and location of your work so we know who exactly we're talking about.
Sure. So my book looks at women specifically in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston between 1750 and 1820 to try to get a sense of to what degree, if at all, the revolution made any changes in these women's lives. So the kind of pre-revolutionary period, during the revolution, and after through the early republic.
Great. And so it sounds like your book has really made a change in previous historiography. So you talk about how historians have long looked at the impact of the revolution on women and their social, legal, economic statuses, but not in the way that you're doing it. And so you've sort of expanded that. So can you talk about the historiography and how you've actually expanded and come to different conclusions?
Sure. I think when I was an undergraduate, I first read Linda Kerber's Women of the Republic when I was a sophomore history major and kind of fell in love with it. So I've kind of been, I could say, maybe plagued by these questions of women in the revolution for, well over a decade and a half at this point. And I think, initially when both Women of the Republic and Mary Beth Norton's Liberty's Daughters were published right around the same time, it was a matter of writing women into the history of the revolution, right? Being like, hello, women were here, women contributed, and thinking about how this larger, I like to use the idea of capital R revolution, right?
Yes.
The revolution had an effect on women and vice versa. And that's been kind of the central organizing principle of the historiography. When I started doing research for my dissertation that then became this book, I remember being down in South Carolina, in Columbia, doing research in the archives and kind of explaining to the archivist that I was really interested in how kind of ideas about or constructions of gender impacted women's lives during the revolution. And I was looking at that point, thinking about looking more at financial records, but he suggested that I look at legislative and judicial petitions, of which they had a huge and very well organized file, which is a dream for a graduate student to have access to. So when I started reading through these documents, I really found these tropes of what I think white male elite society would have designated as, traditional femininity are coming through in the language that women are writing to those very men, right? To the state legislatures and to judges in the court system. So I, was kind of taken aback because I was kind of deeply uncomfortable with the notion that, women were parroting these ideals that basically argued that they were subordinate to men.
Right.
I'm like, oh, are they accepting this? Is this something that they're interested in maintaining? But the more I read, the more I was thinking about using this language as a strategy or a tool to get what they wanted out of these petitions. So all of that is kind of a roundabout way of answering your question and thinking about rather than how women impacted the capital R revolution or vice versa. Think about how women kind of seized the opportunities that they had with the tools at their disposal, kind of thinking on their own terms what was available to them, the ways in which they could move the needle, and, you know, acknowledging the ways in which they couldn't, but still were trying to make something of the moment, of the language on their own terms, trying to kind of recenter the focus on women rather than inserting women into this grand and often masculine narrative of history.
Right. I love that it gives them agency, but also that it's now from their perspective.
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot before it was how men were interpreting women versus women themselves creating their own narrative.
Yeah. Or at least kind of thinking about how women experienced the revolution through a kind of masculine lens or a masculine standard or definition of the revolution, right? Which is pretty exclusionary when it comes to women.
Absolutely. So to start off with the women in your book, can you talk about just off the, when you start your book, what are the rights that women have and what are the obstacles that they face? So we can start off sort of understanding where they are in society.
Well, a lot of it certainly depends on women's marital status primarily, but also their race and their class. Obviously, the rights that an elite white woman, who perhaps is a kind of plantation mistress outside Charleston, are going to be very different from the women that she enslaves. So in terms of women who either had access to property themselves or, married into a family that had property, they had quite a bit more leeway, although, traditionally, the English common law custom known as coverture really restricted women's ability to have an independent legal identity, especially when it came to property ownership. So there are instances in which women, perhaps before they're married, they have inherited property, or perhaps they had done some work in their own and they had property in their own name. But as soon as they were married, the law considered the married couple as kind of one unit under the law, with the husband as the head of that unit. So she would lose kind of control over that property, as well as in most cases, the ability to sign contracts in her own name, to sue in court. There are kind of rare instances and carve-outs that are available. So that's the kind of status for married women. In terms of marriage itself, whether women were able to separate or divorce was contingent upon where they lived, either the laws in the colonial period or, once the United States is independent in these different states. And it really was a broad spectrum of access to divorce. And then, we can think about enslaved Black women, for example, whose marriages would not have been legally recognized, who themselves were legally considered property and, would have been, if a white woman's enslaver husband passed, he could deed enslaved people in his will to his widow. So it really is a matter of understanding women's experiences intersectionally, right, based on race and class especially, but also because of the divergent legal systems at this time really depends on where women are as well.
That's very interesting that the location has such an impact on what we look at as federal law.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find any sources for any, I imagine not enslaved women, but any indigenous or Black women who were able to or tried to submit petitions?
When I was first doing dissertation research, I was maybe a little naive about the number of petitions by women of color I thought I would find. I can probably count on one, maybe two hands, the number of petitions that I found out of thousands that were submitted by Black women. So there are a few. The best ones I found in terms of trying to get at Black women's experience were in the records in Boston. There are a few petitions, and one that is very famous by a woman named Belinda Sutton, who was enslaved to a man named Isaac Royal, who ended up being a loyalist and fled during the Revolution. And she has a series of petitions that she submitted to the Massachusetts General Assembly over a period of, I want to say, about a decade, where she's basically, I wouldn't say demanding necessarily, but firmly requesting that the legislature give her the money that she was owed in Royal's will, that he had arranged for her freedom and for her to have a kind of annuity that would help her take care of herself in freedom. And the first petition that she submits is really beautiful in its prose. I've talked about it on another podcast. Many scholars believe that she wrote it with the assistance of an anti-slavery activist named Prince Hall, and they kind of describe together the experience of being, taken from freedom in West Africa to slavery in the British colonies, and why she believed she deserved the money under law. And some scholars argue that this is the kind of first demand for reparations for slavery. So the opinions are kind of mixed on that. But other than that, there really were not a lot that I could clearly identify. And in part, that's a problem of the archive itself, the way it's organized. For example, when I was searching for petitions written by women, it was pretty easy to kind of recognize in the indices and things like that, women's names. And then I would go, find the sources in the archives, and the archivist would assist me in that. But there was no clear way to tell racial identity. In some of these, especially the judicial archives in Boston, I'm thinking of, the indices are very inconsistent. There are some clerks who would record the racial identity in various ways of the people who showed up at court, but then there are others that wouldn't. And there are, we'll say, many microfilm reels of indices. So that would be a really great project for someone to go through and identify and kind of get the metadata of the demographics of the people who were present at the court throughout that period. But it just wasn't an achievable goal for me while I was researching this book. So I would love to see someone do that. But I decided to try to approach for the book understanding Black women's experiences by looking at different kinds of sources where I knew they would be. Right. So I looked at manumission records, especially in South Carolina, where these sources were written by enslavers because they had to have a deed to prove that they assented to the manumission. But what I argue in the book is what you can really see is the anti-slavery activism of the formerly enslaved people themselves, right? Because enslavers are not generally generous and willing to free enslaved people all the time. So you have to imagine that enslaved people are advocating for themselves and pushing for this in various ways. And some of the language is quite explicit on that front as well.
Right. And I love how sure you couldn't find these petitions. And by the way, if anyone watching this is a grad student.
Yeah, project.
And you like digital history and numbers and databases, here you go. Here's a great idea for you. And also that it's a good lesson in if the main source you want to use isn't giving you what you want, that there's something else out there that you could make work within the realm of what you're writing. Mm-hmm. And you also talk about, so the name of your book is Independence, and I'm purposely having a space in between them because it's 2 words.
It is.
And you do define what you mean by dependence in your book, as well as independence. So can you explain to us, is it about power dynamics, and is dependence and independence, are they complete polar opposites where it's all or nothing, or is there sort of shades of dependence?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was a great setup there, Lynn. Thank you. I argue in the book that independence and dependence are not, binary opposites of one another. We don't have to think about them in that way. And instead, a better way to think about them is on a spectrum, right? And I think, we've already discussed the ways in which women's racial identity, their class, where they're living, and certainly their connections to men in power are all really important. There is a very kind of obvious spectrum of even expressions of power, right? So we can argue that in early American society, most everyone was dependent on someone else in some way, and it's just a matter of the degree to which they were dependent or independent. So I borrowed from Jared Hardesty, who wrote a book called Unfreedom and thought about freedom and unfreedom in this very way. So I really thought it was important to underscore this because, I find this especially in the classroom that students assume that before the 19th Amendment, women were just kind of like powerless in society. They had nothing going on. And then all of a sudden, like, white women can vote. So it's fixed,
the
right?
light comes on. Yes.
Yeah. Aha, power. So it's really hard to kind of deconstruct that. But I think it's really worth doing in a society where the vast majority of people would have been disempowered in one way, shape, or form, but did not mean that they were completely disempowered. So there are, shades of dependence and independence in all of these women's lives. And it's a matter of thinking about it on a fluid spectrum rather than binary opposites.
And speaking of that, the even the question of voting, it's not like all men could vote
right
when the nation was founded.
Yeah.
So it's slowly that more people are gaining more of their rights.
Well, and as we know, some women could for like a half second in New Jersey.
Right, in New Jersey.
And Black men as well. And then not, right?
Yeah,
so
a little blip in history. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So speaking of the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the nation, did things change for women? What happened in the Revolution? Because for myself, I've studied a lot on slavery, and you have these men talking about freedom. I mean, Patrick Henry literally says, give me freedom or give me death. And he talks about slavery.
Sure.
So, of course, people hearing this, enslaved people, oh, that includes us.
Yeah.
So what about women?
Yeah, that's what I find really interesting because there's been plenty written about, the Abigail Adams types, the elite, well-educated, well-read women that are in some cases in the room or in rooms with men who are in the room, right? Who are, spreading ideas about women's rights and women's education in ways that we would be familiar with today. But as we know, there were not really big or significant legal changes for the most part for women as a direct result of the revolution. There's a movement in the early to mid 19th century to alter women's property rights and divorce law in some places. I think Pennsylvania is probably the place that has the most clear change in divorce law that's a result of the revolution and small r Republican ideology. But I think the women that I look at who are submitting petitions to the court and to state legislatures are struggling, they're suffering, and their most immediate need is to get whatever it is that they're requesting from the state, whether that's money, some other form of relief, right? Some clemency for their husband who's been accused of loyalism. So they are not, at least they would know that it's not wise to challenge gendered norms when you're trying to get something from men in power who have certain ideas about what women should be and how they should behave and what they should say. So I think when I was first working on the dissertation, I was kind of uncomfortable with the idea of making the argument that women's dependence was good, actually.
Right.
Like, do I want to say that? But it ended up being more, I think, nuanced than that. And hopefully that comes across in the book that, at a certain point, it doesn't necessarily matter for my purposes whether women believed this or not. What they did was recognize that it was an effective strategy to get what they wanted from the state. And for the most part, it worked. I think we can talk about like the likely negative effects of women en masse assenting, at least tacitly, to these ideas. But like, as I said, their most immediate concern was their survival, the survival of their children, right? Am I going to have a roof over my head? Am I going to have my husband back? Right. So, for them, the primary concern was not, hey, how can we use this moment of upheaval to argue for expanded rights for women collectively, right? They're thinking like, how am I going to have money to pay for food next week?
Which I feel is very different from the historiography and
Yeah.
from what we do read.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why your book is so important and just so fascinating. And I think the way you put it as, yes, they were in this condition, but they learned how to exploit it
Yeah.
to benefit themselves. I think that's a good way. And you're not saying that the dependence is a good thing, but that they were able to find agency within their situation.
Yeah. It's a very confining system, and we can't expect them to be able to like bust through it and out of it in one fell swoop when they do not have access to equal rights and equal education and any number of other difficulties and challenges that they're facing along the way. Yeah.
Right. They're doing what they can with what they have.
Exactly.
So do you have any examples, any particular women that you'd like to talk about that sort of are a good example for your argument, what you're talking about in your book, or maybe just a favorite story? That's fine too.
Oh, I have lots. I like to joke that I'm kind of like, in some ways, the Jerry Springer of the 18th century, where these poor people must just think like, they're desperate in like, 1794 or something, and they're pouring their hearts out. And then this woman, like 250 years later, is going to be combing through their most desperate moments, especially the divorce records.
Oh, I bet.
Wild. Yeah, the depositions are revealing. But yeah, I think my favorite chapter was the one where I looked at women's networks, women kind of relying on one another, especially when the state or their husbands failed them. So this is where I think there's clear evidence that women understood that this was an effective strategy, that they were choosing to use it because they were learning from each other. So I'm going to blank on the women's names, but there's two women in Boston who are clearly friends. And I'll just say like woman A submits a petition for divorce to the Suffolk County Court in Boston, and her petition is denied. And then I find, this other woman, woman B, who has done the same thing, petitioned for divorce, except hers is accepted, her divorce is granted. And then, I forget exactly how long after it was, but woman A comes back to the court and says, hey, I submitted an application for divorce a little while ago, and my friend did as well. And her situation is not as bad as mine. And you gave her a divorce, so could we try this again, basically? And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. So that she gets the divorce, right?
I love that.
Yeah, it was really wild for me to read that, basically to be like, can you, check your records again? Because if we're being held to this standard, then certainly I should be accommodated here. There's also, stories of women seeking divorces, and in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania law, these depositions were required. They needed some witness testimony, which is why these sources are especially rich. And there are instances where, female neighbors, female friends are deposed to answer questions about, this couple's marriage. And more often than not, they will just harangue after these men and basically give examples in which they, the witnesses, had to intervene to protect their friend from, domestic violence or something like that. And I think, it's a clear example of gendered solidarity in a way that, they wouldn't have had the language for at the time, but we certainly do. And that gendered solidarity cut both ways. When men were kind of asked about these same situations, it was exceedingly rare for them to kind of challenge the authority of their male friends and neighbors in their marriages in a way that women did not have a problem doing. Even when we have two witnesses who are married, right, who live in the same home, who obviously, share a connection with these neighbors, witness the same stuff, and men are reluctant to say anything, and women will just go off on their neighbors. Yeah.
I love that. And
Yeah.
I think you're making us all want to read some of these
Yeah,
petitions.
it's really fun. I think, not a lot of them are online. That would be a really fun digital project as well for someone to kind of transcribe them, make them widely available.
That would be amazing. Grad
Yeah.
students or
Yeah,
someone who has a lot of
exactly.
funding who would
Yes.
like to
Someone with money, go for
fund
it.
a grad student.
Yeah.
Yes. So can you talk a little bit about this gendered sort of protection? And you talk about that as the opposite of the roles that men, at least elite white men, are supposed to play in women's lives, which is as their protectors for sort of safety and survival, and how this gendered solidarity sort of pushes against that or changes that a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, I mean, going back to this idea of coverture and married women having to basically give up their independent legal identities, in exchange, women were supposed to be provided with, various degrees of protection from their husbands. Primarily, we're talking about financial support, because if they couldn't contract in their own name, they couldn't own property, they needed someone to do that for them, to take care of them financially. But there was also a matter of kind of emotional support that they wouldn't have necessarily called it that. But obviously, many men fell short of these expectations. And sometimes women would turn to the courts or to the legislature to try to mediate these problems. But oftentimes women just turn to their female friends or family members. So there's a number of women during occupation of these various cities that would request passes to exit the occupied territory and to leave to go, live with their mothers, their sisters, their friends, sometimes as far as Canada or back in the UK. And it's clear that implicitly they don't have a man to rely on, or, for whatever reason, their husband is no longer available to be that protector.
Right.
So there's a way in which the state is a protector as mediator in a lot of cases. Certainly the state acts as a protector in these cases where women are seeking divorces, that they need someone to protect them from oftentimes abusive marriages. But there's also a way in which women protect each other when both the state and their partners fail them.
Right. See, that's very interesting, because then you start to see ideas to push against this idea of coverture and the less and less need of this male protector.
Yeah, and I will say coverture is kind of, it's the ideal, and it's oftentimes how the law works, but there's also carve-outs. For example, all three of the states that I look at had a status called femme sole trader. So this carve-out basically enabled women to conduct business in their own name apart from their husbands. So it would be a kind of workaround from coverture while women were still technically legally covered under law in their marriages. What they would need is their husband's consent. They'd have to sign a contract that granted women this ability, and then the legislature would sign off on it. But oftentimes what we see in those documents is that men admit that their wives are better financial providers than they are. So there's a kind of emasculating element here in what they're doing, but it also kind of underscores the fact that coverture really doesn't work for everyone, especially, but in a lot of ways it just doesn't. It's not a sustainable system in a lot of ways, and they have to create these exceptions that a lot of people take advantage of.
And that's a great example of, just because a law was a law, it doesn't mean that there weren't exceptions and that everyone was following it too.
Yeah.
To the letter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the 3 states that you focused on, and maybe similarities, differences, and was there a better state to live in?
Well, I grew up outside of Philadelphia and I went to college in Boston. So I've always been very kind of captivated by these places as, centers of revolutionary activity.
Mm-hmm.
I really was interested in doing this kind of comparative study to think about change, especially when you're thinking about legal history. Having these different jurisdictions to compare is useful. And Charleston was another, obviously, major and very important city during the Revolutionary period. All three cities were occupied at one point or another by the British, and then not. And I often think of these places as kind of existing on a spectrum as well. Boston is on one end, Charleston is on the other, and Philly is usually that like Goldilocks in between.
Yeah.
And again, being a Philadelphian, I always am going to advocate, I don't know if I can say go Birds on this, but go Birds.
Sure.
Yeah. So it depends. If we look at an issue like divorce, for example, Massachusetts, from basically its founding as a Puritan colony, Puritans believed that marriage was a civil contract and that if it was broken, it could be dissolved, right? So they're looking at it from a very kind of secular standpoint in that way. So I should say divorce was pretty much available, although still pretty rare, from the founding of the Massachusetts colonies. Mm-hmm. In Pennsylvania, it was possible, but difficult and expensive. You had to go through a kind of individualized legislative process. So usually it was only wealthy men who could afford the time and money to do this until 1785, when the law changed and divorce was bumped down to the county courts, and the justifications for divorce were expanded, including, if your partner had deserted you for, I think, 4 years or more, you could apply for a divorce. So there were a lot of women. Right after that 1785 change, we see the numbers of divorces spike because it's once again, it's available really to them for the first time.
Right.
And in Charleston, in South Carolina, there was no option for divorce until Reconstruction,
Wow.
when the federal government, required these former Confederate states to rewrite their state constitutions. They included divorce, although the backlash to Reconstruction did not just harm newly freed people, it also harmed women. And I believe it was the mid 20th century when South Carolina finally legalized divorce again after the Reconstruction period. Yeah, pretty wild. So again, like this is a spectrum as well. So trying to look at and evaluate the degree to which women's lives changed during this period really depends on where we're talking about.
Right.
But even so, I mean, in South Carolina, women could not legally divorce their husbands. But as you said, there are ways in which the law is not always followed to a T. Mm-hmm. People would kind of separate and just remain separated without a legal recognition of that separation. Okay. For the wealthy, there were different kind of workarounds, marriage settlements and things that were signed prior to these unions that had kind of carve outs if something happened in the marriage, which was basically just to protect the property of the wife that she would bring to the marriage, because they were very concerned with these kind of dynastic family wealth. And the femcel trader status was pretty popular in Charleston. So a lot of even middling women were taking advantage of that. So they could kind of have their own money in some ways and have somewhat of a separate legal identity. So it's squishy.
Right. And I like that you're using 3 examples of states, but at the same time, it's a good snapshot of the nation at the time.
Yeah.
The colonies and then the nation.
Yeah. New England, middle colonies, and the South.
Right. And so one of our main goals for this show, for Revolutions Reconsidered, is to not just talk about these individual revolutions in the Atlantic world, but how they impacted each other. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, they were going on around the Atlantic world at this time. And one thing you mentioned that I really liked in your book that I wanted to ask for a definition of, because I think it will lead to the connection to the Atlantic world. But you mentioned the gendered expectations of white femininity in the Anglo-American Atlantic world.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I wanted you to explain what that is and what these white women are. What is feminine at this time?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. I
I
think
know.
one thing to kind of put this in context is that, the expectations of gender for both men and women were not uniquely American or exceptionally American. They were inherited from Anglo culture, right? Because
Mhm.
these were English colonies. So they have long roots in I think like the long 18th century, we could say. And these are standards that applied across the Atlantic world,
Mhm.
where the British Empire touched. But they are, again, very contingent upon race and class. So the expectation that women would be, oh gosh, I have a quote that I often use in my book talks that's like, this is what the good wife is. And I'm sure it's in the introduction to the book, but it's like
Mhm.
chaste, pure, and unblemished in every thought, word, and deed I've done it enough that I have that to roll off my tongue.
Right.
And the joke is always like, because that's so easy, right? Every thought,
Of
word, and
course, it's
deed.
natural.
Yeah, but the kind of the general idea is to be submissive and subordinate to men, kind of meek and vulnerable.
Mhm.
I have written a bit about the kind of trad wife movement that's very
Mhm.
popular in social media right now, and it has like very much echoes of these um, 18th century Anglo-American values about gender. And what's wild to me is that like these were the ideals, but plenty of people didn't follow them, right? There are
Right.
expectations of gender and race and class and all of these things, and there are plenty of people that diverge from them, right? This is what's written in the literature, but
Mhm.
people's lived experience is much different. So an attempt to try to imitate that nowadays is just kind of funny. It's like trying to live the 1950s ideal, which really was not lived by most people anyway. So,
Right.
yeah, it's what people might think of as stereotypically feminine, and I can use like scare quotes feminine
Mhm.
because it's what you might think about in movies or in books and in the culture, but it was not
Right.
really the reality for most people because it was a difficult thing to achieve. It was based on the privileges of whiteness and the privileges of class,
Mhm.
right? Because if women weren't working, or if they had the leisure time to pursue feminine arts or things like that, they had
Mhm.
to be of a certain position in society. So it was not realistic for most people.
Absolutely. And so I wanted to tie this question into how your research, your story, your book fits into this idea of the revolutions of the broader Atlantic world. So if we were going to do a timeline and talk about all of the revolutions, how would your book fit into that?
It's interesting when I was transitioning from the dissertation to the book and thinking about what I wanted to do to expand on the dissertation for the book, I really wanted to add more places.
Hmm.
And my ideals were Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Kingston, Jamaica, both
Okay.
places that remained part of the British Empire
Hmm.
for a period of time, and would have given me a bit more diversity in source material, and to try to test whether what's happening in the United States is different or consistent with what's happening in the British Empire after the Revolution. Because of funding and time constraints and things like that, that didn't happen. So again, if somebody wants to go ahead and do that project, please do. Um, but I think, yeah, it's a tough question to think about without having the primary sources from these different revolutions. Um,
Right.
but when we think about the American Revolution in the context of Atlantic revolutions, it's certainly the least radical among them,
Hmm.
and it's not close. So it's perhaps, like a small c conservative revolution in a lot of ways. And when we think about how it affected women, it was less in terms of practical changes or maybe discernible changes that we might put in a textbook, but it was more of a change in consciousness, I guess I would say, about how women thought about themselves and their relationship to the state and potential citizenship as well. So, women are exploiting these ideas about dependence in their petitions throughout the entire period I study. And really the language does not change much at all, except they start to use the language of rights beginning in the early to mid 1770s and beyond. And they are describing things as rights that are not new to them. These are not rights that they're all of a sudden gaining as a result of the revolution. These are rights that they would have had prior to the conflict. They're just calling them rights now. They're recognizing them as such. So they're recognizing themselves as being rights-bearing individuals. So that's a really critical change, because in order to, push for more rights, you have to first see yourself as a person endowed with rights, or who should be endowed with rights and perhaps needs more under the law. So we don't really see a huge amount of collective action among women until, the 1840s, really, with abolition, with women's suffrage. But that wouldn't have been possible without women first recognizing that they were deserving of rights and they should have rights, and there were rights that they had under the law that they could use to push for more rights. So that's part of the kind of larger language of rights that's moving across the Atlantic world at this period, not just in the nascent United States, but in France and in Haiti especially, right? So that's something that's kind of in the water in the late 18th century, I think.
Wow, I think that was a fantastic answer. I mean, you're making me think now that it was redefining women's consciousness and how they're defining themselves. And it wasn't just in the new United States, but it was around the Atlantic world.
Sure.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Jackie. And I appreciate you being here for this wonderful interview. I want to again say that we've talked about several projects that need to be done out there. So funders and grad students, please pay attention. In fact, I will put all the information in the show notes. So just scroll down on the page, show notes, everything you need. But first in the show notes, I will have a link to purchase Jackie's amazing book, which again is called Independence, Women and the Patriarchal State in Revolutionary America. Get out and get it today, ideally from a local bookstore. If not, then maybe a place online, or see if your local bookstore can order it for you.
Bookshop.org is a great place because you can always designate a local bookshop to kind of order it through.
Perfect. Thank you. We're going to put that link as well down in the show notes. So make sure after you watch this, you go down into the show notes. And I think this has been a wonderful interview. Thank you so much for taking the time. It has been wonderful to see you. For those who don't know, we went to George Mason University for our
I realized
PhD
I was
programs.
wearing my T-shirt today too.
Yes, proud Masonite. Go Mason, go Birds, right?
Go Birds. Terrible.
Oh, so thank you so much for being a guest with us today,
of course,
Jackie, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Revolutions in Retrospect. I'm Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, your host for this episode. Thanks to our producers, Dr. Jim Ambusky, Patrick Long, and Jeanette Patrick. Please share the show on social media and help other listeners find it by rating and reviewing it on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Revolutions in Retrospect is a joint production between Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media.